Okay. Hello, good afternoon, everyone. The person behind the voice is Meredith Kirkland-Burke. I'm a social worker and forensic interviewer at the Suspected Child Abuse and Neglect Program at the Hospital for Sick Children in Toronto. A bio was included, but just very briefly, my experience and my current work is in the area of conducting forensic interviews with children on behalf of Children's Aid and police, typically in fairly complex cases where children are quite young, 3- and 4-year-olds, present with some significant motivational issues, behavioral issues, mental health issues, which may have an impact on their ability to provide disclosure if there is disclosure to be made. And so I get involved in those cases and, as I said, conduct the interviews directly with the kids. I apologize for the fact that this will be a faceless presentation. My preference is to be in the room with everybody and to have an interactive style of teaching. But I guess the payoff here is that there are many sites logged in from across the country, which is great. I'm going to just go ahead in my slides here. Oh, they didn't hear any of that? Okay. Should I start from the beginning? No. No. Okay. Sydney? Progress. Okay, so I progress just with the, okay. Sorry, due to technical difficulties we're working out. I'm going to start with a definition of a forensic interview. For those of you who logged on last week and were part of the webinar by Dr. Sonia Brubacher, you would have seen this definition as well. Sonia and I have tried to coordinate our talks to a certain degree so there's not overlap. So as is written here, this is a definition taken from a consensus document that was generated from a number of different training groups down in the United States. And they define a forensic interview as a developmentally sensitive, legally sound method of gathering factual information. In the definition, you'll notice that a lot of the work we decide, the reasons we decide to conduct the interviews the way we do are based in some part on research that's been conducted both in a lab setting and a field, but we also know that a lot of the work we do is practice informed and it's the best evidence that we have, and we don't necessarily have good research to support certain aspects of our protocol or our approach. For instance, the introductory stage of your forensic interviews, introducing who you are, your role, the child's role, as well as the closure stage of a forensic interview. We don't really have research to sort of support, you know, are we doing this the best way possible? What also is important to note is that for those of you who are conducting investigations with respect to child abuse and neglect, it's clear that the forensic interview, of course, is only one part of your investigation, albeit often a very important part, particularly in sexual abuse cases where there's not often a lot of corroborating evidence. And then lastly, the important thing to note here is that forensic interviews need to be both developmentally sensitive and legally sound. And I think Sonia probably spoke quite a bit to the issue of how we conduct interviews so they're legally sound by talking about the interview phases and the types of questions we know we need to ask to get reliable information from children. So today, I'm really going to focus on what about this issue of conducting developmentally sensitive forensic interviews with kids. I'm really going to sort of focus on kids ages 2.5, 3 to 12 years old, because this is the area where kids are most sort of rapidly developing in terms of a number of their developmental skills. And I'm going to look at these different areas of development: memory, suggestibility, language, conceptual knowledge, particularly how well can children give us time frames, and look at some issues around social emotional development. This isn't going to be sort of a university course in child development. It really is, what do we know, what do we need to know about those particular areas of development as a forensic interviewer when you're sitting in the room with the child conducting that interview? How is this information important around how we ask the questions and how we approach these interviews? And then again, for those of you who have had the pleasure of interviewing the little guys, the 3- and 4-year-olds, generally people will agree that they provide us some extra challenges in terms of conducting forensic interviews, mainly because of their limited development. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time at the end throwing out some ideas about a bit of an alternative approach with these little guys. And then, this is not my typical style. I typically like people to ask questions as I go along, but given our timing, I hope if people could just hold questions to the end, and I'll try to leave about 10 minutes of time for us to discuss the questions that come up. Okay, so I'm going to show the group a little clip here. This is an interview conducted with a few different children, and what I'd like you to just pay attention to and note is the amount of success or lack of success the interview is having at obtaining accurate and reliable information from children. Okay, so again, I would usually throw it out to the audience here to have some sort of feedback about what people observed, but again, given our setup in the interest of time, I think we see a couple interesting things here, and that is number one, a number of those kids, when they were asked questions about, who is the Virgin Mary and so forth, you sort of saw their eyes wander around a little bit with maybe a question mark in their head about what the answer is. But in our society, we often have a belief that good students always know the answer. And we know that this is one element of child development, that kids, from a social context anyway, feel that even if they don't know the answer, they need to provide a response, because that's how things go in society. Someone asks a question, someone gives a response. We can see the kind of the downfall of leading questions. Did Santa love Mary's cookies? Did Joseph get mad? You see the difficulty of the young boy at the very beginning being asked who was born on the first Christmas. Again, first Christmas, what does that mean? It was a sort of an unclear question. Does that mean this boy's first Christmas? Does it mean the first Christmas ever? And then you see kids mixing together probably stories they've heard around Christmas with their own personal histories, such as Mary and Joseph becoming estranged and Mary getting involved with God, etc. Now, there's a little guy at the end, the gold, frankincense, myrrh boy, some kind of optimism there that he was able to monitor the source of his and the limit of his knowledge, and he was able to say he didn't know what frankincense was and what myrrh was, and so he sort of overcame that sort of pressure, that social pressure to give an answer if he didn't know, and was able just to acknowledge his uncertainty. The reality is when we leave kids to their own devices, when it comes to questioning strategies, we can very much question how reliable kids can be and how accurate they can be in giving us information. So in the 1980s, 1990s, there were a series of now have become famous investigations at daycare centers down in the U.S., where ultimately there were a number of very horrendous, almost fantastical allegations made around sexual abuse and satanic ritual abuse. And those allegations came at a time in the history of forensic interviewing where we weren't as evolved and as good in terms of understanding how we needed to talk to kids to get reliable information. And unfortunately, I think that there was a perception left with the public that can kids really be reliable witnesses? Do they have the baseline ability to do that? So over the last now 20 or 30 years, since a lot of these daycare cases, there has been a ton of both lab and field research around children's abilities to give accurate event reports. And what we know now is that we're not asking the question anymore if kids are reliable or unreliable. We're now asking under what circumstances are child witnesses more or less reliable. And so just as a person who's hard of hearing needs a sign language interpreter, or a person with a particular disability is going to need some kind of accommodation, someone who speaks a different language needs a language interpreter, we know there's certain things we need to put in place, circumstances we need to put in place for our younger kids who are in forensic interviews to make it a fair playing field for them. So when we think of the potential influences or the circumstances that impact a forensic interview, we of course are talking about child development. So interviewing a 3-year-old is going to look very different than interviewing an 18-year-old. And so this is obviously one thing we're going to take into consideration and spend the majority of time talking about today. We also know, though, that the event characteristics, so the relationship between the victim and the alleged offender, we know will have some impact possibly on the motivation for that child to talk about possible abuse. We know that in the intrusiveness of the abuse, the age at which the abuse started, that all of those variables can impact a child's ability or motivation to talk about an alleged event. We also know that interviewer behavior can have a huge impact on whether or not we can gather accurate and complete information from kids. And I defer back to Dr. Brubacher again in terms of her talk from last week in terms of those things that we have to really pay attention to. So in terms of child development, as I mentioned, we're really wanting to cover off these 5 different areas. So in terms of memory, just sort of a quick and dirty sort of discussion about a very simplistic model of memory development. We know that in any kind of given situation that any individual kid or adult will select pieces of information from that particular experience to put in their memory. That's the process called encoding. We then know that that encoded information goes to a place somewhere in your brain where it becomes stored and it becomes a memory. And then we know there's the third process of retrieving the memory, which is really the business we're in when we're doing forensic interviews with kids. I give sort of an example as you guys watch this webinar today. You know, if you come back into work tomorrow and your colleague says, oh, I wasn't at that webinar, how did the webinar go? And you go into your memory and retrieve out the memory you have of the webinar. In all likelihood, from an encoding point of view, you're probably not going to report, you know, what kind of flooring was in the room where you're sitting or what the ceiling looked like. That's probably information that you're not going to encode and not store and not retrieve. So I just wanted to sort of be clear about this memory process. So what we know sort of vis-a-vis kids is that by the time kids are 2.5, 3 years of age, they typically can develop autobiographical memory. And what we know is that there seems to be some link or association between developing autobiographical memory, so memories of their personal experiences, with their language development. So when kids develop language, the ability to develop memory also occurs. We are aware of something called infantile amnesia, and the reason I mention this in the context of forensic interviewing is because sometimes we have to sort of answer this question. So infantile amnesia is the phenomenon where pre-verbally children may experience events and be unable to recall those events when they're an older child or adult. So this came up, for instance, in a case of an 18-month-old who had a pretty significant burn, was hospitalized, treated for the burn, and about 2 or 3 later, some evidence came forward which raised some concern around non-accidental trauma for this kid in terms of that this child was actually purposely burned. And so the question, the child was about 4 or so at that point, the question was, should we interview the child to try to get an account of what actually happened? The reality is given infantile amnesia, likely that child wouldn't be able to access that memory because likely the memory wasn't even created, although that's not completely clear in the literature yet. The other thing we know about memory is that as kids age and get older, their memory capacity is enhanced and it increases. So for the little ones, we know that they, at the outset, will typically encode less information from any given experience, and they will recall less detailed memories. So, you know, this is always the classic example when anyone goes and picks their kids up from daycare or school, or they say, you know, tell me what you did at school today, and the child says, you know, I played and I had snack and there was recess. Which is all very true and very accurate, but of course very incomplete. The other thing we know about younger children is that they will forget at a faster rate, forget memories at a faster rate than older children and adults. So I always have this inclination that I'd like this to be sort of quantified a little bit better, because from a forensic interviewing point of view, sometimes it's really important to ask the question, well, how much detail should I expect a 4-year-old to give me around that alleged event, or a 7-year-old, etc. So this is one study I pulled that sort of helps me with this a little bit. These were a group of 5-year-olds who were in this would be more like a lab setting where the event was being controlled. The kids were participating in this pirate show. It was sort of interactive, feeding a bird, painting a map, finding treasure. They interviewed these kids right after, like, you know, within minutes after they had experienced this pirate show. And they being the researchers, had figured out that there were about 60 pieces of sort of unique information that the kids might have chosen to encode and remember. And what they found is that kids, right after the interview, remembered about 15 out of the 60 pieces of information, representing about a quarter of the information. And then this same group of kids were interviewed 6 months later, and we're able to remember or recall 8 pieces out of the 60, so 13% of the information. So there's really not a mathematical formula for the rate of forgetting, but what we know is that forgetting usually is most rapid right following the event. And this study is pretty clear again that encoding for younger kids is going to, we have to be realistic about the fact that they're not going to be attending to everything and encoding everything, and that there is the reality of forgetting. Factors in the literature which may slow down forgetting, which of course are of interest to us as forensic interviewers, again, would be a child who's experienced an event that's been important and personally significant to them, and the child also had an opportunity to tell about that experience on multiple other occasions. There's the belief that that sort of cements the memory a little bit more in storage, and is clearer when it's being retrieved. So the implications for practice around some of this memory business is, again, being realistic about the amount of information, particularly young children would be able to retrieve. Particularly if you're in 2 weeks I have to interview a 6.5-year-old boy who is really, given the way supervised access happened and so forth, I'm really going to be asking him about something that happened about 1.5 years ago. So I need to be really realistic about the realities of forgetting memories, and that is remote in time, and it might be hard for him to access that, just from a memory point of view, not from a motivational point of view. The other thing we know about memory retrieval is that it's a reconstructive process. So it's not like going on to your computer, so working away at a document last night and then this morning coming into work and going to that same document and opening it and finding it unchanged from when you left it. What we know about memory retrieval is that it can be rebuilt, it can be changed, it can be modified depending on how it gets retrieved, depending on the environment when it's being retrieved. So this was a while ago on CBC, I would say it was about 1.5 years ago. They had a program on memory, and they were interviewing this man. He was an adult. He had been raised and grew up in Ireland. And he, as a young child, he had a similar age brother and then a younger sister. And he told this story of one time sneaking out of the house with the brother. So the brother and himself put their little sister in a stroller and took her for a walk. And what had happened is, over years and years and years, the story kept being sort of retold in at family gatherings, at holiday times, and so forth. And over time, as they retrieved these memories, he was left with the notion, the real memory, that not only had they taken the sister out of the home, without permission from mom, but they got to sort of a hill or an incline at some point, and they purposely let go of the stroller and then ran and caught it at the end before anything happened. So it was sort of a game that they developed. This man, he was living in Canada at the time of the interview at CBC, but what he had done is he had gone back to Ireland and gone right back to the place where this alleged stroller rolling down the hill had happened, and in fact it was a completely straight area where there would be no rolling stroller. And again, it's over time, as these memories were retrieved, probably embellished for the sake of entertainment at family gatherings, his memory had in fact changed. So again, practice implications as well is, we're really setting in a forensic interview, we're setting that environment for memory retrieval, and the importance of interviewer behavior around using open-ended prompts, like Dr. Brubacher probably would have emphasized a lot last week. Reducing social demands of the interview for the child, so giving the child to admit that they don't know or it's not clear or they don't understand, and always having that sort of unbiased hypothesis testing approach are really important. So we provide the child as neutral an environment in which to retrieve their memories. The other thing we know about memory retrieval is that the initial retell of information does not necessarily include all the information that the child's encoded and stored in their memory. And so what we know is that over time, children and adults will remember other pieces or additional pieces of that memory, and it won't necessarily all be retrieved on that one at that one sitting. And this is what we know around memory. The other reality is that we know disclosure around sexual abuse is typically a process as well, and it's more common for kids to give information at intervals over time. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about really the process of memory, that we know that this can happen in increments. I'm going to just talk briefly about a case I was involved with this 3 or 4 years ago. It's a 5-year-old girl who had been shopping with her mom at a store in Toronto, and unfortunately the mom had left the child for a short period of time in the toy section and had gone to another area of the store. And during that time, this young girl, 5-year-old girl, was approached by a man and was sexually assaulted. She told her mom within about 8 hours of the assault, so that same night. The following day she was interviewed by police and gave a very good description of the sexual assault, in terms of what he did, where she was in the store, where mom was. The only thing she couldn't do was give a good description of what this man looked like or what he was wearing. And so about 8 days later, I re-interviewed this girl because, of course, what had happened is this girl was in an area of the store where there wasn't video surveillance, but they did have video surveillance in the other part of the store, so they had it sort of narrowed down to 7 or 8 different men who were in the store, but without some kind of clearer description from this child about what this man looked like, they were at a bit of a loss. So I interviewed her 8 days later, and she gave a very clear description of this person's face, facial hair, eye color, what she did. She could not remember what he was wearing, but she did remember that he had a buggy and what was in the buggy. He was wearing a hat, which ultimately was very helpful. I use that as an example around, that we know again that kids aren't necessarily going to give us all the information in a one-shot interview. So that being said, implications for practice. I don't know how well this is regarded across the country because we do come out of an era where it has typically been a one-shot interview with you to reduce suggestibility and so forth. But pendulum is a little bit back to some reconsideration around a second interview for children. The reality is that second interviews present both disadvantages and advantages, which you see here. Little Johnny, who goes and gets interviewed once by police and then comes and sees me a second time, maybe in his brain he's saying, oh my gosh, they don't believe me, I guess I'll just say something to get them to be quiet, right? So there's sort of that social pressure in terms of taking a second round. And then there's more room if there is interview bias. If an interviewer thinks they know what has happened, there's more room for that to kind of creep in to the interview setting. The advantages of second recall is that it accommodates what we know about memory around that kids will disclose information at different points in time. It accommodates kids who have brief attention spans, our 3- and our 4-year-olds, and for those kids who have motivational issues, fear, embarrassment, guilt, shame, a second interview may be helpful around rapport building and trust building for that child to feel comfortable to say something if they have something to say. these are the cases where I would consider doing a second interview. I think you have to think through very carefully. It's really the high suspicion cases and where kids are bringing sort of an extra complexity to the interview, whether it's because of their limited development or their mental health issues or behavioral issues or developmental issues. The other issue is I've interviewed kids where there have been multiple offenders and there's just literally not enough time in a 40 or 45-minute interview to go through all of the information, or kids who've experienced multiple types of maltreatment. So you're asking maybe about physical abuse, exposure to DV, and neglect concerns, and there just is not necessarily enough airtime to get to all that, get to all those concerns. So if people are considering multiple interviews or second interviews, it's really the pendulum swinging to not so many how many interviews people are doing, but the quality of the interviews that are being done. So if people are considering this isn't about, you know, sitting a kid down 2 separate times and asking them the same questions on 2 different occasions. It's stretching your protocol over the 2 sessions without repeating questions, because we know around the dangers of repetitive questions and suggestibility. And of course, if people are, again, thinking about this, we really encourage interviews as soon as possible and limiting the time in between the 2 interviews. Okay, I'm going to move on to suggestibility. So again, most people have, I think, some sense who've been working in this field around what suggestibility is, but it is really the process where anyone is involved in a particular experience, and any information that they're exposed to or provided with after the fact, it's the extent to which that information will blur, change their memory of what really did happen. And what we know with suggestibility is that the retelling of the memory can be altered by post-event information, as well as or the memory itself can actually be altered due to suggestibility. And I know historically or traditionally we usually talk about the custody and access cases in these situations where you get worried about coaching and contamination, where, you know, Johnny comes back from dad's house after an access visit, access weekend, and mom starts asking about daddy, and did daddy touch his pee-pee, and how did daddy touch his pee-pee, did daddy hurt his pee-pee, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some sort of practice implications for that. But first, I'm going to show you a 4-minute clip. This is little Tristan. He's 4 years old. What I'd like you to do, again, is just sort of watch out to see if suggestibility becomes an issue here. I'll tell you it does. And maybe if you can sort of have an eye to what it is that creates the suggestibility issues for this little guy. Okay. What room? In this experiment, we tested the reliability of child eyewitnesses along with the process of child suggestibility. Our hypothesis is if we ask a child the same question multiple times, we will eventually be able to change his mind. We took 4-year-old Tristan to the beach about 2 weeks ago. Keep in mind, while we were
While you're watching the videos, the swings are broken, and it is well known that Tristan has not let go of his grandma's hands in the water.
All right, first question. Do you remember going to the beach? Yeah, did you have fun? Who did you hang out with?
I have no idea.
What?
I don't know because I just slept.
You don't know because why?
Because I slept.
You slept at the beach?
No, I sat in my bed.
Oh, you slept in your bed? Who did you sleep in your bed with?
My mom.
Mm-hmm. Do you remember when you were at the beach? Do you remember when you went on the swings? Yeah? Yeah? Did you fall off the swings? Are you sure you didn't fall off the swings? I'm pretty sure I saw you fall off the swings. Did you? Are you positive? Okay. Wait, do you remember when the slide flipped over? Yeah? You were there? Who had to go out and get it? Huh? And what do you do?
Bring it closer.
Bring it closer? Okay. What did you eat at the beach? What did you eat? Look at me, what did you eat? You have no idea. Did you eat at the beach? Yeah? Well, what did you eat?
I don't know.
Did you have a hamburger? A hot dog? Did you have chicken wings?
Yeah.
Yeah? Did you have ice cream? No? You didn't have any ice cream? I thought you had ice cream.
No, it's not.
You did some ice cream, man? Okay. So, are you sure you fell asleep?
Well, I did fall off a little. I just fell off one time, and then I got it.
You fell off one time?
Yep.
Mm-hmm. All right. What else did you do at the beach? Did you go swimming? Did you get deep?
Okay, so there's little Tristan, 4-year-old Tristan. Again, I'd like to throw it out to the group. I'll just sort of quickly summarize.
Did you go into your head?
Here we clearly see the dangers of a number of things. One being repeated questions, lots of yes-no questions. You know, what did you have to eat? He first says, I have no idea. Are you sure you don't remember what you had to eat? Yeah. And then, did you have a hamburger? Did you? So those are the, you know, again, the yes-no questions, not in the child's first answer that they provided, which was, I have no idea. And the issue around him putting his head under the water, very clearly, the interviewer here provides a message to this kid, post-event information, that she believes he did in fact put his head under the water. Did you go in under your head? He says, no. Are you sure? Think hard. I thought I saw you. I remember seeing you, and the lifeguard came to get you. So these type of questions, this pressuring kind of technique, the repeated questions, where we want kids to conform to certain ideas and messages, is suggestibility very clearly. And of course, what we always want to avoid in our forensic interviews. We do know that the younger the child, the greater risk around them being susceptible to suggestibility. We know that by about age 10 for a normally developing kid, they will behave similar to adults with respect to how suggestible they might be. But we know for these little guys, they're extra susceptible to suggestibility. So these are, again, I apologize, there's sort of very broad practice implications around suggestibility. But again, what we know, and again, this would have been some of Sonia's material last week, is using and sticking with a forensic interviewing protocol there's not necessarily a best one. There are a number of protocols that are, in circulation right now, but we know that we can typically do better quality interviews if we're using a protocol, we're exhausting open-ended questions, we're giving kids permission to say they don't know or they don't understand, asking child to promise to tell the truth, which again Sonia would have mentioned last week, completing a developmentally sensitive interview, and again using that hypothesis testing approach. So in this example, the interviewer not being hell-bent on convincing this child that his head had actually gone under the water, but being open to what it was he was going to describe in terms of what happened at the beach that day. A couple other things about memory, and again, this is pretty relevant for a forensic interview context, is we know that there's sort of two different types of memory, one called episodic, one called script. Episodic memory is when a person retrieves a memory of a particular event at a particular time, at a particular place, with particular people there. Script memory is often memories that we form around something that we do on a more routine basis. And we develop memories of things the way it usually happens. So the example I always think about is going to the dentist. Like they typically, you go to the dentist, I don't know how many times over the years I've gone to the dentist, but I go, I sit, I wait, the dental hygienist takes me in, they clean my teeth, well they look at they ask me questions first, and there's sort of a, a pattern, a consistent pattern. Bedtimes is another thing with lots of little kids. Often there's sort of a typical structure to bedtimes. They go up, they put their pajamas on, they brush their teeth, they read a story, they kiss goodnight, whatever it is. A lot of young kids who go to school, same thing, going to school, there's again a fairly defined sort of framework or routine to that. The sad reality is that when we're talking to kids about sexual, physical abuse or neglect or emotional harm, witnessing DV, that a lot of times kids have had repetitive experiences of these various forms of child maltreatment. And so sometimes they're going to come in with memories that are script memories as opposed to just coming in with one particular episodic memory. So the direction from the field at this point to sort of manage this in a forensic interview is that kids should be encouraged initially to give their script memory, what usually happens. And as an interviewer, your job is to listen to their narrative, to their script, and pull out, if possible, any little leads or labels which would indicate to you a specific event. And once the child's been given that opportunity, because we would never ever interrupt a kid who's in the process of providing some disclosure or substantive information, once they seem to be finished, you identify those leads and you go back and you ask for episodic memories using the leads. So I'll give you an example here. A child says, my big cousin always does bad things to my privates. He puts his finger up my bum all the time. So again, with these adverbs always and this all the time, there's sort of the suggestion that things have happened on more than one occasion, and perhaps this kid's in script memory. So again, the suggestion would be for the interviewer, tell me all about your cousin always doing bad things to your privates and putting his finger up your bum. It's a simple, general, open-ended question to try to get the child to elaborate more. And the child says, my big cousin would usually gets me to watch sexy movies and makes me kiss his pee, except for the time when we were at the cottage. He would always take pictures when he hurt my privates, and one time he almost got caught by my stepmom. So what you see here is a couple labels that leads that this particular child has just given in his or her spontaneous narrative. That being the time at the cottage and the time he almost got caught by my stepmom. So again, as a forensic interviewer, you said something about the time at the cottage. Tell me all about the time at the cottage from the beginning to the middle to the end. the other reality here is the importance of letting kids give script memory is that often when you let them give their script memory initially, you end up getting more information. Kids produce more information. We know it doesn't have any impact on the accuracy of the information. And we also think that it can sometimes improve the credibility of the child's statement, that when a child gives information that way, it's sort of information that sort of hangs together a little bit better and seems a little bit more coherent. In this particular example, you know, if the interviewer had said, oh, you know, your cousin puts his finger up your bum all the time, tell me about the last time that happened, or tell me about the worst time that happened, or tell me about the time you remember the most, what we might have missed is the fact that there's sexy movies being watched, that there's oral genital contact that's been invited. And so those are pieces of information that we might not have even asked about if we had right away sort of just focused in on the bad things to this child's private. So again, those are your leads and your labels. Because ultimately, I don't know how many people are here from a child welfare or a criminal investigation background, but often police in particular need a particular event and time and place in which to, you know, determine charges and so forth. And so really what we are trying to do with the kids is separate out the incidents and get to episodic information. If we can't get those leads and labels from kids, or we've gotten those leads and labels from kids, again, these are some other ways we can have kids separate out some of that information, which are things I've already sort of said, and you can see there on the slide. Okay, one word of caution, I try not to do this, but every once in a while I still catch myself doing this, is to make sure that we use the actual words that the kids are using when they're giving their leads and their labels and their narratives. So there was a study done where it was found that people who routinely were interviewing children were actually changing the language of the children's labels about a third of the time. And we didn't sort of know, the study wasn't clear about whether it had an impact on accuracy, but what was clear is that that sometimes made us lose the kids, and that the kids would often have difficulty understanding what the interviewer wanted them to further elaborate on or give more details about. So it's really important to keep that in mind. If the kid says the time at the cottage, then we need to say the time at the cottage. And using their words and their specific language, I think it demonstrates, you know, that we're listening to them, that we're doing active listening, and then it just reduces, and it reduces the potential for confusion on part of the child around what the interviewer is asking for. Okay, memory, source monitoring. Again, another important thing to keep in mind for interviewers, particularly with the little guys, the 3- and 4-year-olds. So again, we know that kids at this age haven't necessarily mastered and have a really good grasp at knowing the source of their memories or of their knowledge. So they don't necessarily know how they know. So the example I give is the little 4-year-old that comes to school and says in circle sharing time that it really hurts when you get stung by a bee. Well, there are a few different places this little guy, this little 4-year-old could have picked up that information. Maybe last night he was outside and got stung by a bee, so he has a personal experience and knows that information. Maybe he was horsing around outside and the parents knew that there were wasps around and said, you better be careful, you don't want to get stung by a bee because it really hurts. Maybe their sibling got, so they were a witness to an experience. They didn't actually have a personal experience around getting stung. Or maybe he was watching the Learning Channel and gleaned that information from the Learning Channel because it was about bees. So these are all different possible sources of how that child has that particular memory. And for the 3- and 4-year-olds, if you say to them, how do you know it really hurts when you get stung by a bee? Sometimes those little guys, definitely the 3 and then the early 4-year-olds, sometimes just they don't have the developmental skill yet to make that distinction. So again, this becomes a pretty important thing, particularly around the area where investigators and interviewers might have concerns about coaching, whether it's inadvertent or advertent coaching. And so with these little 3- and 4-year-olds, it gets really tricky. As kids get a little bit older, it really is important to make sure that we're asking how do they know that, how do you know that daddy beat up mommy? What did you see? You said daddy beat up mommy. Tell me everything that you saw. Tell me everything that you heard. And then whatever they give you, you know, again, get them to elaborate. So using sensory information. Who did they talk to about mommy and daddy having fights? Tell me all about that. The other thing I routinely do in kind of query concerns around, again, inadvertent or advertent coaching is I will often ask kids at the end of the interview fairly explicitly, did someone tell you to tell me something today, or did somebody tell you not to tell me something today? It's a yes/no question. It's not the best question, but if anybody has a suggestion of a better way to do that, I'd be happy to hear it. The last thing around memory is self-representation. I don't know how many people routinely use aids in their interviews, whether anatomical dolls or drawings, human figure drawings. I will sometimes use the drawings with the younger kids more as a demonstration aid. So if a child has provided disclosure, these can be used for the little guys who have the limited language to show or draw or circle or scribble on as opposed to telling. I also think there's no harm in asking child to show and demonstrate on themselves sometimes, as long as they're not going to pull their pants down in the middle of the interview, which unfortunately has happened to me before. But what we know is if you are going to be using human figures, drawings, or anatomical dolls, especially with anatomical dolls, the APSAC has a whole protocol around when they're used and how they're used. But what you need to determine is that the child has the developmental skill to understand that the doll or the drawings are a representation of themselves. So we know that this emerges around 3.5, 4 years of age. So a little bit of a word of caution, if kids are younger than that, they might in fact not really be able to get that self-representation concept. Okay, language and communication. I appreciate that I'm speaking really fast, but I have a pretty ambitious agenda here, so I'm going to keep plugging through. So I don't know if people have this book. I'm going to take a stab at talking about language and communication. If people are interested, I would recommend, this is a 3rd edition. It was published in 2013. It's Anne Graff and Walker. It's a really good, a lot of it's very, again, practical. It's really, I think, designed for the forensic interviewer or the lawyer who's questioning children in the context of court. So what we know is by the time, again, I'm talking really about normally developing kids, so a normally developing 5-year-old, what we know about those kids is that if you listen to them talk and converse, they sound a lot like us. They speak in full sentences, they have a decent vocabulary, you know, their intonation makes sense, you know, their voice goes up at the end of a question, and as I said, the grammatical structure is in place and so forth. However, what we know is that they sound like us, but we know that at age 5, they still don't have the same language and cognitive skills that we do as adults. Add to the picture that we know that many children will not correct adults or ask for clarification, which I'm going to suggest is part of the way we socialize children, that adults know best. Adults usually are testing kids around their knowledge. We defer to adults. And then add to that sometimes children think they understand a question but they don't. We know that children can have some limitations in appropriately and accurately monitoring the limits of their knowledge. So that all put together can sometimes get us in a bit of a pickle and leads to some miscommunication and misunderstanding. So one of the realities is that kids will sometimes use a word. It'll be part of the vocabulary, but their understanding or definition of that word is different than the adult understanding of that word. And that's particularly true for a lot of these concepts around time, duration, space, age, and kinship being, you know, family relationships and so forth. So a lot of these words that are ahead, behind, before, after, again, these are both time-based as well as sort of prepositions in terms of spatial language. A young kid, if you ask a kid, you know, when was yesterday, in their mind, yesterday really just means any time before now. That it doesn't mean Wednesday. Same with tomorrow, right? I do quite a bit of teaching with police officers, and I was in a teaching session a couple of years ago, and one of the officers offered this case where they had done an investigation with a young girl who had made very clear disclosure in her forensic interview that every night her grandpa would put her to bed, and he'd tuck her into bed, he'd read her a story, and he'd give her a kiss on her private spot. And the police felt that she had given a pretty good disclosure with quite a bit of context and details, and so they proceeded with a charge. And it wasn't until sometime after that that someone took some time, I'm not sure who did it and how it was done, but some clarification of what private spot occurred, and this child's private spot was near the middle of her forehead. Again, very different definitions from an adult point of view and a child point of view for that particular word. The other thing we know about young kids and language development is that they can often be very literal and concrete in their use of language, which actually I find a little bit refreshing sometimes. So this is an example where an interviewer said, "Did you put your mouth on daddy's penis?" Again, hopefully there were lots of other much better questions before that question was asked. And the child said no. And what it came down to, it wasn't, the child was really clear about the fact that the child didn't put his mouth on daddy's penis. Daddy put the child's mouth on daddy's penis. So it was what wasn't right in this child's very literal interpretation of that question was who was doing the putting on, and so the child responded no to that. The other, I was watching an interview 5 or 6 years ago now where a little boy, he was quite active as a 4-year-old boy, I remember, and it was an officer interviewing him. And he was one of these guys that was taking advantage of the soft room kind of furniture in a lot of the interviewing rooms at police stations. He was jumping off the couch and heads in on the couch and moving around the room. And at one point, the officer was being so patient, and she said to him, "Hey, so-and-so, can you take a seat, please?" So he goes over to the couch cushion and takes the cushion off the seat and brings it over to her. No, she said grab a seat, sorry. So he grabbed a seat, right? Again, a very literal interpretation of what he was asked. The other thing we know is that kids will not use groupings of words and classifications of words like we do as well. So the example here is the interviewer says, "What clothes were you wearing?" in the context of an interview, and the child says, "I wasn't wearing clothes." The reality was the child was wearing pajamas, and for this child, pajamas didn't fall under the classification of clothes. Pajamas in his or her mind were different than clothes. So using very concrete, specific language with these kids is really important. Another example, the interviewer says, "Tell me all about the time you went to Uncle Jim's house when your mom was not there." The child says, "I wasn't at Uncle Jim's house," because, again, this child, Uncle Jim lives in an apartment. So again, just one word that's different could you know, lead us to missing some, you know, really important information from these kids. The other thing we know is that for young kids as well, they typically have a very restricted definition of touch. So for lots of younger children, 3, 4, 5, 6 years old, when the word touch is used, often what comes to their mind is the picture you see on the slide here is, you know, someone using their hand or their fingers or their index finger, you know, to touch something. And if you think about it, even some of our protocols, our forensic interviewing protocols, often use the word touch. So I know of protocols down in the States, the Child First and the old RATAC model used to often ask about okay touches and not okay touches. But the reality is for lots of kids, touch is just that. It's a hand touching something else. So I find in a lot of interviews with young kids, if they're going to make some disclosure around genital touching, they'll often use much more specific language. You know, I had to rub his penis as opposed to touch, right? He was poking me with his finger in my privates. You know, he licked my pee-pee. Tickle's an often common word that kids will use as well. So again, it's really important to try to be as inclusive as possible to make sure we're not sort of missing things as well from kids if we're just using that specific word touch. Okay, and again, a lot of this stuff is, I think, pretty, you know, I don't think it's rocket science for anybody around avoiding complex multi-part sentences. But this is an example. I took this out of the Anne Graffin Walker book. So this was a 5-year-old being questioned by a lawyer during a murder trial. Do you recall talking to her on the Sunday after they discovered something had happened to Doug and asking her, do you know Mark? And then saying, that is who did it. Do you remember telling her that? I mean, this poor kid, I think I counted 4 different questions that she was asked there. Does she recall even, you know, talking to her, whoever her was, talking to her at that specific time, asking her something, and then telling her something? So again, this is, again, it's not rocket science to try to avoid this kind of questioning, but what we ultimately are doing, we're asking this kid to put 4 different questions into her working memory, go back, retrieve the relevant information for 4 different questions and come out with it. And that's just, you know, not a fair expectation for a 5-year-old. Avoiding jargon, categories, again, using simple words. Using nouns versus pronouns. So if the child's talking about mommy and daddy having a big fight, I need to know, and then daddy hit mommy, as opposed to I need to know more about what he did. It's always using daddy again, just to be sort of very clear and to avoid confusion. And again, simplifying words and sentences. So I think the first, so these 3 sentences essentially ask the same thing. I think the first one has 11 words, the second has 7, and the last is 5. And you can read them there. So again, it's really important that you're trying to be as simplistic as possible with these little guys in terms of the language that you're using. Okay, so this is a study, look at that, hot off the press, January 4th, 2017. Published by Tom Lyon and his group down in California, which I assume probably a few people will be, or many people are aware of Tom Lyon and his very applied research for forensic interviewing. So this was a study where they wanted to look at the question of how we ask children about clothing placement during forensic interviews. And the first point they make is, you know, they look at a number of transcripts of forensic interviews and they make notice of the fact that probably 60% of times or more, kids are being asked about clothing placement, their clothing placement, other people's clothing placement in forensic interviews. And that is very common in the context of kids being questioned in court to ask these questions as well around clothing placement. And he makes the point that sometimes clothing placement is important to decipher intent as well as the extent of a potential sexual act, for instance. So if kids are going to talk about, you know, every time Uncle John comes over, Uncle John gives them a massage, and you ask about clothing placement and you realize that Uncle John's massage means that kid has to take all their clothes off and Uncle John has to take all their clothes off, and that's where we get a little bit more concerned versus Uncle John's coming over, everyone keeps their clothing on, and the kid gets a rub on her upper back or up on her shoulders or something like that. And again, in terms of how much clothing, you know, it might give, how much clothing is on or not on, it might help investigators be clearer about, you know, fondling versus penetration and so forth. And so what they did is they interviewed, I think it was about, let's check on my notes here, about 100 children ages 3 to 6, and they really wanted to figure out what is the best way, what is the most developmentally appropriate way of asking children about clothing placement. So the children, it was a lab-based experiment, so they were actually given like drawings of figures and given stickers. And so kids were asked, were clothes on or off? Were the clothes on or off for something else? Or where were the clothes? So these were sort of the 3 questions that kids were asked. Up until this time in our field, until this study has been sort of published, it's really been, the direction the field has been ask that question with the second one, were your clothes on, off, or something else? Because it is multiple choice, but you're giving that something else so the child could choose a different answer besides on or off. And what they found is when the best question to ask of children ages 3 to 6 when we're asking about clothing placement is, where were your clothes? It seems superior in terms of kids being able to give not just a one-word answer. And it became really important when children were trying to explain intermediate clothing placement. So when kids, for instance, pants or underwear were just pulled down to the knees, or a shirt was lifted up to the neck area but not taken all the way off. So when it was sort of these in-between places where kids' clothes were, they weren't completely on, they weren't completely off, the where question allowed kids to give a better description of that intermediate placement. Okay, so implications for practice in terms of a lot of this language business. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because Sonia probably had a little bit of a discussion about this, but this is a stage near the beginning of the interview where you're actually asking the child an open-ended question about a recent event, a neutral recent event. And there, as I mentioned at the beginning, there's areas of interview protocols that are well supported by research and some not so supported. And a lot of that is because the research just hasn't been done. But in this case, the research has really gone to support that this is a very helpful exercise for us to do with our kids in our forensic interviews. And when I watch interviews, my observation is that most interviewers, after there's sort of an introductory sort of interview instruction phase, that most interviewers take some time to try to, at minimum, build rapport with kids. Try to get kids to feel more at ease, get more familiar, look interested in talking with them and learning about them. And I would suggest that if you're going to do that and when you do that, as opposed to, you know, what grade are you in, what's your favorite subject, who's your teacher, do you have friends at school, as opposed to asking those yes, no, or direct questions, is to ask an open-ended question. And the reality is it helps us on many fronts. And what we know, first of all, is that it makes that child more productive as the interview unfolds, particularly during the substantive part of the interview. But it helps us from a developmental point of view understand how that child communicates and talks, and a little bit around their cognitive skills and abilities as well. So it gives us a chance to listen. How long are their sentences? Can I understand what they're saying? What's their vocabulary like? How well can they attend? And then the other thing I find is really important is that you can take at the end of an interview, see how well they've done in that narrative event practice where you've asked them about the neutral event and compare it to how they've been able to describe or not describe the alleged sexual abuse, physical abuse, whatever, child maltreatment event. And sometimes that is really helpful to weed out that actually maybe Johnny has the ability developmentally to tell us his information. There's something that's an impediment for this little guy in terms of it might be sort of more based on his motivation. So it's helpful in that sense, and it's helpful for the interviewer to calibrate their language to match that of the child's. Okay, conceptual knowledge, time. So the question is, at what age can normally developing kids accurately provide time frames? Say what day something happened, what month, what season, what time of the day. And, you know, it really is an important question often in, again, in the context of both child protection investigations as well as criminal investigations. Often this time stamping is important around laying charges in that, you know, an accused is given a time frame in which he or she can have an alibi. It's also important sometimes for investigators to go back to a certain period of time to get corroborating evidence or a corroborating witness. So time often is very important for us to have a really clear idea about. Anyway, again, I can't sort of solicit the audience around when people think kids can developmentally do this. I was on a class trip with my youngest child. She's 8, so she's in grade 3. We went on Friday, and we went to this like conservation area. We got there, and the guide said there were about between 40 and 50 8- and 9-year-olds, and the guide said, "Oh, it's great, you're here. How long did it take you to get here?" And the answers were 2 hours, 82 minutes, 47 hours. They're all over the place. It took a half an hour to get there. A clear demonstration that definitely the 8-year-olds don't quite get it yet. So I always go back to the study, again, done by Tom Lyon and his colleagues down in California. And in this study, again, about 167 6 to 10-year-olds asked questions about them being when, what season they were apprehended and placed in care, and then timing around when they attended family court. And they were also asked how many placements, foster placements they had been in and how many court visits they had made. So they, again, were trying to understand how well these kids could time stamp, as well as how well they could accurately describe how frequently something happened. And what they found is that, again, kids ages 6 to 10, about half of them accurately identified how old they were for a court visit or placement. Being able to accurately identify the season or the month when they were first placed in care was based on chance, not good. And again, you can see there a very low percentage of kids who were able to accurately report the month of their last court visit, which would have been, of course, closest in time, probably the clearest memory. And again, about 21% accurately reporting the season when they were at their last court visit. So not great. And of course, as you can imagine, you know, it was the 9 and 10-year-olds that did, you know, did better, who were probably representing those, you know, those groups who did it accurately. And again, less than a third of the kids were able to give an accurate number of placements, foster care placements. Unfortunately, all the kids in the sample had been in more than one foster placement. And again, a small percentage gave an accurate number of court visits. So the take-home message in terms of practical applications are, do not ask kids under the age of 10, when did X or Y happen? And do not ask kids under age 10 how many times something has happened. And don't be deceived, because in this study, that same group of kids, they asked them their current age, their current the current season, I believe it was, and when their birthday was. And kids did quite well on those questions. So they were able to say, yeah, I'm 5 years old and my birthday's on November 6th. And it's winter right now, but the caution is just because kids can, you know, timestamp currently their age, their birthday, that shouldn't lead us to believe that they can do this for some of these remote historical kinds of events. So then what do? That's the question, right? You still have to go in there and in some way kind of sort out time a little bit. So these are some things that I use. Again, I'd be interested, my email's at the end, I'd be interested to know if people have other ways of tackling this issue. Again, for school-age kids, were you in school, not in school? So you could get, you know, July and August separated from the rest of the year. What grade were they in school? Who was their teacher? Where were they living? What was the weather like outside? Kids at a young age can usually sequence events in time. So if there were 3 or 4 incidents, you could at least get them, tell me which one happened first, and then next, and then next. And usually young children at a fairly young age can do that sequencing. Using a point in time, I find lots of interviewers do this. You know, you said X happened with Uncle Billy. Did that happen close to your birthday, before your birthday, or after your birthday, or before Christmas or after birthday? First of all, you have to be careful about whether they've got the concepts before and after, because these are often trickier concepts for the little guys. And before and after, or near or far away, are still pretty subjective terms. So I'm not sure how helpful that often is in narrowing down the time frame. So again, as opposed to asking kids how many times something happened, the suggestion is, did that happen one time or more than one time? And if the child says, oh, it happened more than one time, then again, use that same, tell me all about the last time or the time you remember the most, etc. Okay, so kids 3 to 5 typically are going to be pretty solid around who, what, and where concepts, but real difficulty with when and how many and why concepts. Same for 5 to 10-year-olds, but they're going to be able to give you some additional detail because they're going to encode more. Their memory capacity is just improving as they age, as we've already talked about. Okay, social emotional stuff. I'm really going to start zipping through this because I think we only have about 15 minutes left, and I want to leave a little bit of time for questions. Okay, so some of the considerations around social and emotional development. We know obviously with younger kids that, you know, we have that limited attention span. However, with a lot of these little guys, and I'm talking sort of the 3 to 5-year-olds, is limited attention, but they also tend to not struggle with the motivational issues as much because they have less, they're less aware of, you know, the shamefulness of sexual abuse and the secrecy around sexual abuse, and that we don't talk about sexual abuse. So they're sort of limited in terms of socialization about that. So, you know, lots of little kids, they just come out and they just say it. You know, that's often helpful from a forensic interviewing point of view. However, as I mentioned before, we know these little guys with, you know, less encoding, weaker memory traces, that their vulnerability to suggestion is greater than older children. And then again, we are already starting to socialize them at a pretty young age about adults know best, and children need to listen and respect adults and defer to adults. So again, there may be that hesitation to correct an adult or say they don't know, that kind of thing. The other thing we know about little guys from a developmental, social, kind of emotional development point of view is they're quite egocentric. So they think you might be a perfect stranger, but they think you should know a lot about their life and who they are and what day-to-day life is for them. And sometimes that becomes a little bit problematic in an interview setting. School-age kids, again, the same issue that, again, we're socializing them, that good students know the answers, deference to adult authority figures, and shame, embarrassment, fear, and guilt might play in, particularly if you're speaking to them around an alleged sexual abuse issue. In terms of adolescents, I actually don't interview a lot of adolescents. Typically kids are under 12. That being said, I've interviewed some. I mean, I think what we know about adolescents is that, you know, developmentally their vocabulary increases, their ability to think about abstract concepts improves. However, that being said, sometimes I've sort of seen interviewers trying to act like a peer with an adolescent or in a more really kind of authoritative way. I think what's important, again, with adolescents is that they can see through us a little bit, and it's really important to be genuine in our approach. And we're not their buddy, you know, we're not their parent. So we are a forensic interview. We need to be genuine in that. And they may, in fact, you know, they're older, they have a greater understanding, but doing the practice narrative with them and building rapport might be just as important as with some of the little guys. Okay, preschoolers. Quick and dirty about preschoolers. So this was a study that was published, I guess, 2012, about 300 kids. I was ecstatic when I came across the study because it sort of cemented for me my experience in the interview room with these little guys. So 3 to 6 year olds who had disclosed sexual or physical abuse, but they took all of the transcripts and they coded on transcripts to figure out how often did kids respond to questions that the interviewers asked, how often did they give an on-track response. So they actually responded to the question that that interviewer asked versus went off on another topic, that topic drift kind of thing. And how informative was the response? How much information were kids able to give with the particular questions that were asked? So what they found is that on average, kids were asked 84 questions, and they really did reply to almost all of them. About 2/3 of them were on track. So again, 1/3 kids would, because of the limited attention and the topic drift, would go elsewhere. And they, again, the younger guys tended to be, you know, off track more often and give less information. So these would be more the 3 and 4 year olds. And so one of the questions that was asked is which type of prompt, and hopefully you saw Sonia's talk last week, elicited the most helpful information from children. And what they actually found is that the WH questions, so the who, what, where questions, were the ones that seemed to allow preschoolers to give us the most information and for preschoolers to be the most productive. The theory was the open-ended questions was too cognitively difficult and complex for kids to go back and retrieve their memories. They needed the benefit of sort of that focused recall WH question in order to recall the information. So again, as I said, this study really, I think, rang true for me in terms of like the experience, the clinical experience in the room with the kids. And as a result, what I've developed, and I have to say this is just mine, I borrowed a little bit from Sandra Hewitt, who's a psychologist down in the States who did do this work previously and wrote a book. So what I've done is I've had a little introduction. So when the preschooler walks in the room, I know the clock is ticking the minute the kid walks in the room. I say right off, I get them sitting in a chair. My job is to talk with boys and girls, and your job is to sit in the chair and talk with me. Sometimes that structure is really important for them. All the meanwhile, I'm reading their cues and their body language. And then I do a pre-screen with them. I ask them a what, a where, and a who question. And what food do you like to eat, or where do you eat, where are you when you eat dinner, or where do you sleep at night, or something like that. And then I ask if they've successfully answered those 3 WH questions, I ask them an open-ended question. I was actually just reading an article yesterday, and I think I'm actually going to adapt and introduce this. So you're going to see on the clip that I'm going to show you, I asked her about going to Canada's Wonderland. So this is something she had done in the fairly recent past. the suggestion in this article I was reading is to just get a picture book, like a kid's picture book, take one page out of it and just show the kid the picture and say, tell me everything that's happening in this picture. So the kid doesn't have to use their memory. They can look at something that's right there and you get a sense of how well they answered that open-ended question. Sometimes with these little guys, depending if they're like 4.5 and older, so I will promise to tell the truth and ask them not to guess and do concrete examples, but we know there's pretty limited efficacy with those instructions with preschoolers. And then I transition to substantive. If the child can't answer the WH questions, I really don't proceed because it's sort of a baseline skill that kids have to, I think, to have a productive forensic interview. Okay, so I'm going to show you quickly. You could watch me and you will be able to hear what we said. I'm also aware that we only have about 5 minutes left. There's one slide left, so if people would like to on their own or in their group after we shut off the webinar, just watch it. It's only about a 3 or 4 minute clip, and identify what some of the errors are in terms of not being sort of developmentally sensitive in terms of questioning this young 4-year-old boy named Aaron. So I'm going to stop talking and field any questions that people have. Will we be able to get a hold of the PowerPoint with the YouTube links to watch after the presentation? Yeah, with the YouTube links for sure. So it's anybody can go on YouTube, right? So please, I think it should be sent out with the YouTube links. The little clip of Amaya's interview we are going to not include, and that's really about respecting that child and family's right to privacy and confidentiality. I really don't want it archived. But the YouTube links for sure. It's Jimmy Kimmel again, and I know he's not a forensic interviewer, but I don't know if anyone has watched his material before, but he seems to have a particular interest in interviewing children. So I think sometimes it can be very interesting to watch how he does it. Any other questions? I know we're really short on time. I apologize for not leaving more time for questions.
I was just wondering if there's a way we can get a copy of these slides.
Yeah. Yes, so my understanding is that they will get emailed out to who's ever on the webinar today with the whole network apparently, and I think there's an evaluation that's sent out as well for people to fill out. So my email is on the very last slide. I'm very happy to speak to people about any other questions that we're not going to have time to talk about today or do any kind of consultation, and email is really always the best way to reach me. Any other questions? Thank you for your time and joining the webinar today, and I think we're going to sign off. Thanks.